In a sealed case in the shrine of the book in Jerusalem sits a piece of leather smaller than a playing card. Most visitors walk right past it. The Aramaic written on that skin is roughly 2,200 years old, older than any text in the New Testament, and the chapter it preserves is the one that explains where the Nephilim came from. The Council of Laodicea removed Enoch from the canon in 364 CE, banned, buried, called dangerous. For most of the next 15 centuries, the only complete copies on Earth sat behind stone walls in Ethiopian churches. Then, in 1947, at Qumran, 11 separate copies of Enoch surfaced in the Dead Sea Scrolls. More copies than Deuteronomy, more than Exodus, more than almost any book that stayed in the Old Testament. Genesis gives the Nephilim 4 verses. Enoch gives them 16 chapters, and those chapters do not read like a legend. The text gives the number of the fathers 200. It names their commander. It names the mountain they came down on and records the oath they swore to each other on the summit. It itemizes exactly what they taught. It records what the offspring did in sequence, and it records what happened to those offspring when their bodies died, which is the part almost every retelling leaves out. Not a myth, not a metaphor. It names them. It names the mountain. It records what stayed behind. In the next several minutes, you will see what the text actually says, what a genetics lab in Germany published in 2018 that matches it structurally, and why the mountain named in Chapter 6 has been a closed military zone since 1974. If forbidden history fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from the record. But here's what makes this stranger. The Nephilim account is not buried in some late medieval appendix. It sits at the very front of the book, chapters 6 through 16, the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers. And it is the oldest layer of the entire manuscript. Fragment 4, Q201, held in Jerusalem, carries Aramaic from chapters 1 through 12 and dates to roughly 200 BCE. Fragment 4Q204 carries chapters 6 and 7 in a different hand entirely, meaning 2 separate scribes were copying the same passage in the same desert within the same century. Dr. Michael Knibb's 1978 Oxford edition, still the standard English text, works from the Ethiopic tradition preserved in Ge'ez. Dr. Ephraim Isaac's 1983 translation works from the same tradition. And the passage does not behave like the material around it. The level of detail is wrong for ancient literature. Apocalyptic writing deals in symbols, beasts with horns, numbers that mean kingdoms, visions that announce themselves as visions. Chapter 6 announces nothing. It opens with a census. 200, the text says, and then it lists the officers by name in ranks of 10. Shemihaza at the head, then Arakiel, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Danel, Barakiel, Asael, Armaros, Batariel, and Anel. 19 names in a row, in fixed order, in a document that names almost no one else. Symbolic literature does not do this. Symbolic literature does not file a roster. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts, and the text walks them in order, like a report with sections. Part 1 is the arrival. Chapter 6, verse 6 states that they descended in the days of Jared, on the summit of Mount Hermon. That is not a symbolic location. Mount Hermon is a real mountain, 9,232 feet, on the modern border between Syria and Lebanon, its southern slope inside the Golan Heights, a place a surveyor could stand on. Then the verse gives the reason for the name. They swore a mutual oath on that summit and bound themselves with a curse, and the Hebrew for that binding curse is Herem, Hermon. The mountain is named after the oath sworn on it, not the other way around. And chapter 6, verse 3 records Shemihaza's exact concern beforehand, that the others would back out and leave him alone to answer for the crime. That is not the language of myth. That is the language of a man organizing accomplices. But the text doesn't stop there. Part 2 is the offspring, and this is where most Bibles fall silent. Chapter 7, verse 2 says the women bore what the Aramaic calls Nephilim. The word is usually printed in English as a name, Nephilim, as though it were a tribe. It is not a name, it is a participle. The root is NPL, to fall, the fallen ones. Every English Bible that prints Nephilim is leaving a word untranslated rather than telling you it means the ones who came down. Chapter 7, verses 3 through 5 then describe what they did, and the escalation is clinical. First, they consumed everything the people produced. When that ran out, they turned on the people. When that ran out, they turned on the birds, the beasts, the reptiles, the fish. And then the text says they began to devour one another. That is not a moral warning. That is a collapse sequence. It is the exact order in which a population exhausts its resource base, written down 2 millennia before anyone had a word for ecology. What follows in chapter 8 is stranger still. Part 3 is the transfer. The text does not say the watchers cast spells. It says they taught. Chapter 8, verse 1 names a sale and gives an itemized list of the curriculum: metalworking, sword making, knives, shields, body armor, and in the same breath, antimony, the compound used for eye paint, and the working of silver and gold into ornaments and bracelets, weapons and cosmetics listed together as a single technology package. Then verse 3 continues down the roster. 1 taught the cutting of roots. 1 taught the loosing of spells. 1 taught astrology. 1 taught the signs of the sun. 1 taught the signs of the moon. Each specialist with a discipline, each attached to a name. Read it as mythology, and it is a list of sins. Read it as written, and it is a technology transfer log. Metallurgy, weapons manufacture, pharmacology, cosmetics, and the observational astronomy that produces a calendar. A near-complete inventory of the Bronze Age revolution, presented not as human achievement, but as something imported, taught by outsiders, itemized by instructor. And then comes the part that shouldn't be possible. Part 4 is what happened after. Everyone knows the flood ends the story. The text says otherwise. Chapter 10, verse 9, records the instruction given to Gabriel regarding the offspring. And it is not drowning. It is to send them against one another, to set them in a battle of destruction among themselves. The fallen ones were not killed by water. According to the text, they were made to destroy each other before the flood ever arrived. The flood cleaned up after. And chapter 15 explains why that mattered. Verses 8 through 10 give the mechanism directly. The bodies of the offspring came from the earth, their spirits came from elsewhere, and so the text says, when the flesh dies, the spirit does not die with it. It remains. Chapter 15, verse 11 says, these spirits stay on the earth, that they afflict and oppress, and that they are not judged. Chapter 16, verse 1 sets the endpoint, the day of the great judgment, and no sooner. The text is not describing a race that was wiped out. It is describing a population whose physical form was ended and whose remainder was left in place. Not destroyed, not removed. Left. Here's what the translators left out. The standard English editions, including our H. Charles 1906 translation, that almost every popular retelling still runs on, render chapter 15, verse 11, in a way that reads as a general statement about evil spirits in the world. The GES construction is narrower and more physical. The word rendered as spirits is manifest, from the root naphas, breath, the same root that produces the word for wind, for breathing, for the thing that leaves a body. Its surface meaning is spirit. Its plainer meaning is breath, the exhalation of something that was alive. And the verb tense in the GEAs is not past. It is durative present. They dwell, they do not go away. They are not judged. Charles rendered the passage as theology. The manuscript reads as a status report on an ongoing condition. There is a second omission. and it is larger than a word. At Qumran, the Enoch material did not arrive alone. Alongside it sat fragments of a separate composition cataloged as 4Q203, 4Q530, 4Q531, and 4Q532, known as the Book of Giants. It is the sequel. It names two of the offspring, Ohia and Haya, records their dreams, and records them realizing what is coming for them. A religious movement in 3rd century Persia carried it as scripture for 1,000 miles, and it is absent from the Ethiopic Enoch entirely. The book that tells the Nephilim story from the inside did not survive in the collection everyone reads. It survived in scraps, in a cave, and those dream fragments were not fully published until 1997 and 2000. The implication sits there. What modern readers don't realize is how closely this matches what came out of a laboratory in Leipzig in 2018. In August of that year, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published in Nature the genome of a bone fragment from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. 2.5 centimeters long, recovered in 2012, cataloged as Denisova 11, it had sat unremarkable in a box because it had no diagnostic shape. It belonged to a girl of at least 13 who died roughly 90,000 years ago. The sequencing showed something never documented before. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan. Two populations separated by more than 390,000 years. She was not a distant descendant of mixing. She was a first-generation offspring, the only one ever found, and her father's own genome carried Neanderthal ancestry further back, meaning it had happened before. The text describes offspring produced by two populations that were never supposed to combine. The science found offspring produced by two populations that were never supposed to combine. The parallel is not metaphorical. It is structural. And there is a second study. In February 2020, in Science Advances, 2 UCLA researchers published an analysis of 405 genomes from 4 West African populations. Between 2 and 19% of that ancestry came from an archaic population that split off before Neanderthals and modern humans separated. There is no skeleton for it. No skull, no jaw, no tooth, no fossil of any kind. They called it a ghost lineage because the only surviving evidence it existed is what it left inside living people. A population with no bodies, only what remains in us. Chapter 15 said the flesh perishes and something else does not. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, where Enoch was excluded from the canon. But the objection was never only theological. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, defended the book by name and noted it was already being rejected by some because of what it said about the angels. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate, classified it as apocryphal and set it outside serious study. Augustine addressed it directly in The City of God, Book 15, and his argument is worth noticing. He did not say the giants never existed. He conceded there had been giants. He said the books attributed to Enoch could not be trusted because they were too ancient to verify. The age of the document became the reason to exclude it. The Ethiopian church, operating outside Rome, kept Enoch in its canon and kept copying it in Ge'ez for 1,000 years. When the Scottish traveler James Bruce carried 3 of those manuscripts back to Europe in 1773, they landed in a scholarly world with no framework for them. Richard Lawrence produced the first English translation at Oxford in 1821. 19th century reviewers treated the Watcher chapters as embarrassing folklore, a late corruption borrowed from pagan sources. Charles's 1906 footnotes hedged the descent narrative rather than address it. The pattern repeats in the modern era. The Qumran Enoch material was assigned to a small circle of editors and sat unpublished for decades. Joseph Millick's edition of the Aramaic fragments did not appear until 1976, nearly 30 years after discovery. The Book of Giants waited longer still. Access to Ethiopian manuscript collections tightened after the 1974 revolution, when the new government classified church holdings as national cultural property. And Mount Hermon itself, the summit chapter 6 names, has been a closed military zone since 1974, when the disengagement agreement placed its slopes inside a UN buffer zone. The most specific geographical claim in the entire text sits on ground civilians cannot walk. Now, here's where it gets active. Thousands of Qumran fragments remain unassigned to any known composition, scraps too small to identify, and some carry Aramaic in the same script family as the Enoch copies. Which book they belong to has never been determined. A former member of one cataloging team described the unidentified material as the part of the collection nobody was funded to finish. And in the Ethiopian highlands, church libraries hold GES manuscripts, never photographed, never cataloged, never read by anyone outside the community that keeps them. Survey teams in the 1960s recorded shelf counts for rooms they were not permitted to open. Those counts do not match anything in the published record. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying 200 beings landed on a mountaintop in Lebanon and fathered a hybrid species. The Book of Enoch is not an incident report from a border crossing. But what the text describes, read carefully, keeps landing on things that turned out to be real. A real mountain with a real etymology tied to a binding oath. A resource collapse in the correct sequence. Bronze Age metallurgy, pharmacology, and astronomy presented as a single imported package, rather than a gradual discovery. Hybrid offspring of two populations that should not have produced any, and the insistence that when those bodies ended, something of them stayed. The author had no genetics, no fossil record, no cave in Siberia, and yet the text sits there in Ge'ez and Aramaic in fragments recovered above the Dead Sea, saying what it has said for over 2,200 years. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If 200 is a roster and not a symbol, if Hermon is a mountain and not an image, if Nephilim means the fallen and not a tribe, if a first-generation hybrid of two separate human populations is now a catalogued specimen in Leipzig, and if a ghost population with no bones at all is still detectable inside living people, then the passage is not folklore, it is documentation. Enoch was not interpreting signs. He was recording an event with names, numbers, a location, and an outcome. In the flat tone, you would use filing a site report. What he describes is either a symbol we have misread for 2 millennia, or it is exactly what he says it is. The fragments sit in Jerusalem under glass. The Book of Giants scraps sit in numbered plates, published a half-century late. The GE's manuscripts sit in Ethiopian church libraries. No researcher has opened. The bone from Denisova Cave sits in a freezer in Leipzig. The unassigned Qumran fragments sit in trays nobody was paid to finish. And Mount Hermon, the summit the text names, sits inside a closed military zone, unwalked, since 1974. The names are still on the roster. The mountain is still off limits. And whatever chapter 15 says did not die with the bodies is still here exactly the way Enoch said it would be. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the next investigation is on screen now.